In this course, we're going to use a few pre-made scenes, mostly this one, which is a small cluster of crystals. The geometry is very simple, very faceted, and the lighting is also simple. There aren't any lamp objects, it's just an environment HDR texture. And in the bottom right corner of our user interface, I've got a small preview render window. And if I hit Shift-Z, you can see what the lighting looks like. But before we begin building our shader, as usual, we're going to start by looking at reference. And here, this first image is a quartz cluster, which is a very common type of crystal. And in my perception, it's sort of like a generic crystal or gemstone. And so in looking at this, I want you to notice three things. Number one is the shape of the object. And as a crystal, it's very faceted, very sharp, smooth surfaces going on. Aside from a few spots, like up here, there's a little bit of surface detail. And in the smaller rocks, there seems to be a little bit of jaggedness happening. But mostly these are very faceted crystals. And then number two, I want you to notice just how much activity is happening in the refractions. So as we look inside the crystal, take note of the variety. There's a lot of light bouncing around and creating interesting bright and dark areas. And what's interesting about this, if you think back to number one, the very smooth faceted shape isn't causing this refractive variety. For example, if we jump back over to Blender briefly, and I select one of my crystals, then jump into the node editor and let's add a new material and change our diffuse BSDF, which I'll actually do over here in the material panel, switch diffuse BSDF to glass BSDF. So this makes our material completely clear. As I bump the color up to white, we can see that it's clearly see-through like glass, but we don't get anywhere near the type of refractive variety that we see in our reference image. And so this is proof that a simple surface will create simple refractions. But with these gemstones, it's unique in that we have a simple surface, but we have very complex refractions. And this implies that there's stuff going on inside the crystal. I'm going to say inside a lot, because that's the real important thing to achieve with this material, is what's happening inside. And then number three, which goes along with number two, is the fact that there's some cloudiness happening also inside the crystal. If we look up here towards the top of the crystal, the refractions are quite clear, sort of glass-like. Even though there's a lot of complexity in the refractions, it's still very clear. But towards the bottom, it approaches this sort of milky white color, and it's not so easy to see through. And this variety happens throughout our crystals. Some are hardly see-through at all, like this guy. Others are very see-through, like this one. So in addition to the refractive variety happening inside the crystal, we're also going to address a cloudy element as well. Okay, so those are the three big things. Now let's go on to the next image and apply those observations here. Now the surface here isn't faceted like the quartz crystal. Rather, it's more of a rock shape with that high-frequency surface detail, which we can understand thanks to the specular reflections on the surface. So in this case, I'm sure the surface is contributing a little more to the refractive complexity. But if you think of this object in terms of thickness, right, like the middle of the object all the way out to the surface of the object, it seems to me that almost the skin of this rock, so to speak, that first layer is very clear, very transparent, with a lot of refractions happening. But then as we get closer to the center of this gemstone, it starts to get a little more cloudy. And this is something that we're going to achieve with our shader, or at least create the illusion of this, which is unique compared to most shaders. You're dealing mostly with surface quality. This one is a unique challenge because we are manipulating actually what's inside the object. Or again, at least doing the illusion of that. The next image is amethyst. This one looks a lot like quartz, except for the fact that there's a color variety. So certain places have a very saturated, vibrant purple, but it fades to a more white color. And so we'll also be able to do this with our shader. And then here's a sapphire gemstone. That's another example of a cut and polished gemstone. So you can see that the reflections tell us that this is very smooth and faceted, like most gemstones in jewelry. But we have an incredible amount of refractive detail and variety happening inside the stone. And that's very important to make it look like a gemstone and not like glass. And then finally, I've got two images down here, which aren't gemstones, they're actually ice cubes. And as I was exploring this shader, I kind of realized that these principles also applied to an ice cube. And so as sort of a bonus, I'll show you how we can use the same shader to look like ice. Okay, so now that we've looked at reference and really framed our perspective and our approach to this shader, in the next lesson we'll begin building it in Blender.